Your stuff in. We have some folders here. Raise your hand and we'll get them to you. Folders to put the 8.5 by 11 white pages that were passed out, those sheets. Anybody need a folder? Going once? Going twice? I feel like an auctioneer. One of the reasons that we have all that material is we want you to be able to have things to take home that could continue to help you and also give you maybe some resources where you can help other folks as well. I want to share with you, before we begin this session, about an annual event that my family hosts, because my family is the Widowhood Workshop Ministry team. The Widowhood Workshop Ministry is my family's passion project. It is our reaction to the loss of my wife, their mother, their mother-in-law, and their Nana. This is our reaction to that loss. We decided to host an annual widowhood retreat. The church that oversees this ministry is in Laverne, Tennessee, which is between Nashville and Murfreesboro. This year, in July, will be the 7th year that we have hosted a nationwide widowhood retreat. Now, I got to thinking, after my wife passed away, I was a director at Senior Week for a youth camp in Northeast Ohio for multiple decades, until I got too old. No, till I need to focus my entire attention on caring for my wife. And we have youth camps for kids. We have CYC, or youth meetings for kids. We have Senior Saints Days to serve our senior citizens. We have Ladies' Days. We have marriage encounters or marriage retreats. Why don't we have something for the widowed? And so this year, for the 7th year in July, we're going to be hosting this retreat. If you would like to get some more of these flyers, there are some here on the front pew. Feel free to share this with anybody else. There's no registration fee. You know, a lot of times when you go someplace, you have to pay a registration fee. There will be, as long as I live, no registration fee for this retreat. Last year, we had 158 people there from 15 different states. And this year, we already have, and this is not till the middle of July, we already have over 70 people registered from, I think, 10 or 11 states at this present time. So we're looking forward to a retreat that is basically serving one purpose. It's all about encouragement. You're going to see after our third session this morning what it's like to be widowed. And one of the things that is a very valuable blessing for the widowed is encouragement. I sometimes have heard people say, well, who needs encouragement? The answer to that question is anybody who's breathing, because we live in a broken world. And everybody's experiencing things that are troubling or challenging or difficult. Some of them are even to the degree of horrific, painful loss. So what we need to do is we need to provide encouragement. The kind of encouragement that different circumstances call for are unique. And that's certainly the case with the widowed. This is an opportunity for widowed people to rebuild their social network with a lot of people with whom they have a common bond. And the common bond is loss. It is a time where we help people spiritually to grow their faith because we participate in a lot of what I call spiritual exercises that help to make us stronger. We have times of devotion together, times of prayer, times of singing. We have some group discussions. We have breakout male-female sessions. But it's all about trying to encourage folks. So July 19 through 21 this year, we're hosting this. And we would love to have you help promote awareness about this event. Now, I do need to mention, if you're married, you can't come. You're not invited. Just like a man doesn't get to come to a ladies' day. Or a marriage enrichment or marriage retreat, single people don't come to. This is exclusively for the widowed. The workshops that we do with the Widowhood Workshop Ministry are for everyone. And obviously, I see everyone in the sense of different circumstances represented in the folks who are here. And we're very glad that you've chosen to be here. The workshops are for everyone because everyone experiences loss. And that's, again, another reason to thank you for not only coming this morning and experiencing the first session, but choosing not to leave and staying here for the second session. I will say this, to put in a plug for the third session, in my opinion, there's no workshop that we ever do where this is not the case. This third session is the most important session. If I had somebody come to me and say, hey, I don't have a lot of time that weekend, but I can break out and come to one session, which one should I come to? This one after this one is the one I would recommend because it's about what it's like to be widowed. Because when you understand a little bit about what it's like to be widowed, you'll be able then to understand what it's like to suffer other kinds of losses. Because what we're doing is we're looking at what for most people is the worst of all losses. And when you're aware of what it's like with the worst of all losses, then you can appreciate more about what it's like for some of the, quote, lesser losses that we might experience in life. I'd like for us to think a little bit about what grief does to us. I want to thank the Williams brothers who wrote the booklet that you received from Cheryl Wayne just now, the booklet about grief, for this mathematical equation. Life plus love plus loss equals heartache, grief, a struggle. Now, the greater the value you placed on what you lost or who you lost, the greater the grief. A few months ago, my oldest brother died. I'm the second of 4 boys. Now, I didn't grow up in the church. My father was an unfaithful Christian until I was about 14 years old. And he decided to come back to the Lord. And he decided his family was going to be a church-going family. I'd never read the Bible. If you'd asked me who Noah was, I wouldn't say he's the youth minister in Paducah, Kentucky at the Central Church. I would have said, that's my uncle. He lives in Tulsa. Literally, I did not know about Noah, about Abraham, about God, about the church. I never went to church till I was 14 years old when my father decided to come back to the Lord. So I grew up in a family for those first several years that was not a Christian family. I had 3 siblings that were all males. We weren't the best of brothers. The best thing that can be said of my mother, besides the fact she was a Christian, of course, she became a Christian when my dad came back to the Lord, was that my mother never spent a day in an insane asylum, though she tried to raise 4 boys. We were not good boys. We didn't have much of a relationship. All 4 of us became Christians at different times, but all 3 of my brothers became unfaithful Christians. 2 of the 3 pretty quickly. I say all that to say this. A few months ago, my oldest brother died. And to be honest with you, it really wasn't a big deal. Now, it did have an effect on me. It did cause me to think about some things. But we were living 2 very different lives for many decades in our lives. He had multiple women in his life. He drank a lot. He had all kinds of issues. And there was nothing that my parents could do or anybody else could do to get him to come back to the Lord. And when he died, because we didn't have that close of a relationship, it really didn't have a profound effect on me. I did attempt to try to get the family together after he passed away. And it was only somewhat successful trying to do that, to get them together, because there was no memorial service for my brother and no committal service. But it matters when somebody was really close to you. It matters a lot. So however close that you were, or however the value was that you placed on somebody, that's going to determine how much grief that you're going to experience afterwards. And some of the grief is going to be awful. What is it like? What does grief do to you? Well, one thing it does is it confuses your thinker. I think that explains why Job said, full of trouble. Man that is born of woman is a few days and full of trouble. Well, that's how he felt. Now, that wasn't his reality. His life was full, just like your life is full. Our lives are always full. As a matter of fact, this particular bottle of water here, 16.9 fluid ounces, I believe. Yes. And if I were to take this off and put more water in it, right up to the brim, it would be full, right? We'd all say it was full. Well, if I were to drink it down to about here, what would we say about the bottle? It's what? Half full, or half empty, or it's full. How could you say it was full if the water was right here? What's it full of? Water and air. All of our lives have burdens and blessings. We always have more blessings than we have burdens. We may not feel that way. We may not think that way. But that doesn't change the fact we are always more blessed than we're burdened. Even Job was. At the worst time in his life, he was more blessed than he was burdened. But he was confused. His thinker was confused. You probably have heard people say, after you've lost someone of very great value to you in your life, don't be making any big important decisions for a while. Some people will say a year. Some people will even say 2 years. And that's good advice because it's hard to think straight after you've suffered great loss. One of the books out there on the display table, written by a woman, she said, when you've suffered great loss in your life, and this she was looking at from a widowed perspective, she said, when you've suffered great loss in your life, you need to appoint a board of directors for your life. Now, you get to be the chairman of the board, but you need to have people on the board of directors of your life, people that are go-to people. If you have issues at the house, or you have issues with the car, or you have concerns or questions about your finances, or maybe you have some spiritual, faith-based issues, you need to have people that you can go to that you can trust to help you. They can be like the board of directors for your life. You still get to make the decision, but those are people who are your resource people to help you. Because we need help when we've gone through great loss, because we're not thinking straight in our life. When I wrote the third manuscript for the third book that I wrote about widowhood that's out there on the table, called After the End Comes, I sent it to a lady, a sister in the Lord that I met when Cheryl Wayne and I were in Apple Valley, California, Southern California. She was really an impressive lady, and I thought, and she was a widow, and I sent her the manuscript, and I said, I would love to get some feedback from you about this manuscript. And so she read it, and she sent me back some suggestions. One of the things she said, she said, Dean, before you put that in print, you might want to get this book called The Grieving Brain. And I'm so thankful that she suggested it. She said there might be some things out of this book that you want to incorporate in that book after the end comes. And boy, she was so right. This book, The Grieving Brain, is a very recently published book. It was written by a neuroscientist who's also a psychologist, a professional counselor. As a neuroscientist for years and years, she spent time studying the brain and, in particular, the effect of grief on the brain. She's done the MRIs, the CT scans, she's done the interviews and the counseling. And this book is actually the result of a lot of her research over not years, but decades of her life. And in this book, there is a quote, a portion of which I want to share with you. Grief is a heart-wrenchingly painful problem for the brain to solve. Now, a lot of people, when they think about grief, the word or the experience, they think about how emotional it is and how it's an emotional problem. Well, it's way more than an emotional problem. It's definitely not merely an emotional struggle. It is a mental struggle. It is a gut-wrenchingly painful problem for the brain to solve. The grieving process necessitates learning to live in a world with the absence of someone that you love deeply, who is ingrained in your understanding of the world. She said, your brain sometimes operates like a video game. You know these video games that kids, some adults too, really, really like to play? Maybe are not addicted, but they really like to play them. And there's like this virtual aspect to those games. She said our brain also functions like a virtual map sometimes. Your brain is not only struck by what is present, it's also impacted by what's absent. You know, for instance, if there was a lion that came into this room, we'd all be frightened. Our brain would alert us that this is a scary thing because of what's there. Now, your brain gets used to things. One of the things that she did with patients initially as a counselor, in her grief counseling, she said, imagine this. One night you go to bed, and while you're asleep, somebody breaks into your house, and they steal your dining room table. You're clueless. You don't know anything about it. Later on, after that theft occurs, you get up in the morning in the darkness of the early morning hours because you're thirsty and you need to get a drink. And you go through the dining room to go where you're going to access the water. And right where your hip should hit the corner of the dining room table, your hip does not hit a dining room table. And your brain immediately is alerted to the absence of that table and sends a message to you. She said, that's what it's like when you suffer great loss. Now your brain is going to have to get adjusted to what's not there. But it has been alerted because it's gotten used to that object being in that room. Just like your brain would send you a quick message if there was a lion in this room. Warning, 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 and you'd react to it. She said your brain also struggles with not just what's present sometimes that may be threatening, but also what's no longer there. It's not just an emotional issue. Grief is not just an emotional issue. It's a mental issue. It's a struggle that your brain is going to have. I love a lot of the things that she mentions in that book. When I read a book, you can tell if I've read a book because there's a bunch of highlighting in it or there's underlining in it. Now, I'm borderline OCD and a recovering control freak. Please take note of how I describe my condition. But when I underline, I have to have a straight edge. It just makes me feel better when I do that. But boy, this book is highlighted because I really appreciated a lot of her observations. It caused me to reflect on how I struggled mentally with certain issues after my wife passed away. It is an experience that confuses your brain. Again, you've got to be patient with yourself and with others because of that confusion in regard to your brain. Now, you've also, in addition to having a thinker, everybody has a feeler. Now, that's both a blessing and a challenge. You're not a laptop. You're not an engine in a car. You're not the pew you're sitting in. You're not a tree. You're not a flower. You're not the sun. You're a human being. You have a thinker and you have a feeler. Now, you're not going to see those terms in an anatomy and physiology book in high school or college, but you do. Everybody has a thinker and a feeler. Everything that we experience in our lives has an effect on our thinker and a feeler. Now, what's really cool is when there's a blessing. It's just such a neat thing because your brain, your thinker, and your feeler are really pumped up when it's a good thing. After my wife died, I had a really terrible time. I was talking to Amy about this earlier. I had a really, really hard time seeing people who had been widowed or divorced being able to have a second bite at the marital apple. That really affected me. I struggled. This shows you how much of a mess I am. I struggled when I was pushing my wife in a wheelchair, and we were in a public setting, and I saw men and women walking hand in hand, and immediately the thought came to my mind, I will never be able to do that again with my wife. And I would have to turn my eyes away from that scene of watching them walk hand in hand. I got over that, but it took me a good while. It really took me way longer than I thought it should. Now when I see people walking hand in hand, as a matter of fact, I mentioned about Goshen, Indiana. I try to walk every day, and so this one day in Goshen, Indiana, I was walking at this beautiful park, and I saw this couple walking hand in hand. I'd never met him before, but I walked up to him, and I said, hey, could I take your picture? And of course, they probably thought initially I was crazy. But then I explained to them, I said, hey, I lost my wife, and I want to tell you how much joy it brings to me when I see men and women walking hand in hand now. And so they let me take a picture. And then I posted their picture on Facebook. And I referenced that experience with them. And I made it a point of doing that for the sake of married people. And I challenge married people to never take for granted having the opportunity to hold somebody else's hand and walk with them. How many times, if you're married, how many times have you thanked the Lord, not just for your mate, but for specific things, like the blessing of being able to have someone to hug romantically, somebody to be able to hold your hand and walk with anytime you wanted, somebody to talk to, somebody to hear their voice. Whenever you've lost that blessing of that other person, your brain is struggling and your feeler is all over the place. James Dobson has written many, many good things. He has written a lot of things that help people personally, helps families. His focus on the family ministry has helped millions of people. He wrote a book called Emotions, Can You Trust Them? After he wrote that book, he wrote another book called Life on the Edge. That book, Life on the Edge, my wife and I bought many times for high school graduates because it's a book about navigating what he called the critical decade of life between 16 and 26, when we are making decisions that may impact the rest of our lives for good or evil. And in that book, Life on the Edge, he said, I wrote a book in the past called Emotions, Can You Trust Them? He said, I can reduce that previous book to one word. No, you can't trust them. He said, we must understand that emotions are unreliable and are at times tyrannical. They like become our dictators. Now, I'm a big sports fan. I love sports. I'm a huge football fan. I think it is so stupid when some team achieves some great pinnacle of success and they win a championship. And you got these people who are just ecstatic. I mean, they are high, emotionally high. And they get a bunch of furniture and they put it out on the street and they lighted a fire and they have a big bonfire and they burn these things that have at least some little value to them, but they're burning these things of some value because they're celebrating their team winning some national or international championship. Now that's just plumb stupid. I mean, that's just taking your emotions and letting them drive you to do things without thinking? Well, when you've lost something of great significance, especially something as unparalleled a blessing as marriage, the number one human being on planet Earth to you, especially, but it could also be a child. Man, your emotions are so strong and they are running in overdrive to the point where they can dominate your thinking. And that's why sometimes we do things or we say things that are just abnormal for us. I mean, they're just not like our past. They're not consistent with our character. That is how dramatically affected we can be by experiences. Great experiences, positive experiences, huge blessings can be a big impact in our lives. And our feeler can run on overdrive. We need to celebrate sensibly. When I was working with the local school system in Stark County called Lake Local School System, one of the things that I was on was the Drug Advisory Council. And every year, about this time of year, we always were concerned about our kids graduating from high school and what could we do to provide some activities for them to help them celebrate sensibly, because we knew for a fact that some of them would be tempted to and choose to rent a hotel room and participate in sexual immorality, celebrating their high school graduation. Or they'd go to parties where there'd be a lot of drinking. And maybe even afterwards, complicate that by getting behind the wheel of the car. When we have great times, sometimes we can celebrate, but not very sensibly. When awful things happen, we can be so dominated by those feelings that we have that we're just not ourselves. And we're going to say things that we typically wouldn't say, do things we typically wouldn't do. I personally cut a lot of slack to Job's wife. When she said, curse God and die, I know we're real quick to criticize her. And hey, I know it's out of place to say, curse God. But what condition was she in? Think about what she had lost, especially those 10 children. All of her prosperity, watching her husband struggle the way he was struggling. She snapped. Well, Job snapped too. Again, look at what he said in Job 7:6. He had no hope. Job, you had hope, you had God. You said your life was full of trouble. No, Job, your life was not full of trouble. It was full. You had a lot of burdens, granted, but you had a lot of blessings too, and your blessings were more precious and more valuable and of more significance than your accumulated burdens. Job wasn't thinking straight. Well, nobody would think straight when they'd gone through what Job went through. And he snapped too. We have got to realize that when we've suffered great loss, we're going to grieve and we're not going to be normal. Now, some of us never were normal, but we're going to be more abnormal than we used to be. Let's put it that way. And we're going to struggle. Please be patient with yourself and others. Now, what we've got to realize is there are times in our life when we're in intensive care. Anybody here ever been in an intensive care unit? Oh boy. Why do people get put in an intensive care? Why? Critically ill. We call it intensive care. You mean to tell me a hospital room wasn't good enough? I mean, who needs care in a hospital? Everybody, okay? But there are certain people that have these experiences. They're in a certain condition or time in their life. They need intensive care. When we've suffered great loss, what we need to realize is this is the intensive care phase of our life. We need help. First and foremost, we need the help of the Lord. Sometimes the Lord does His best work through His people. Or even people who may not be His people, but people that He has providentially blessed us with in our lives. They might be the neighbor next door. They might be somebody we work with. God doesn't need a miracle to help us. He can providentially bless us with the people and experiences we need to help us to get to where He wants us to get in our life. Imagine laying in an intensive care unit and the nurse comes in and explains what she's about to do. And then after she explains about this juice she's going to put in this bag, it's going to run through this tube and go into your body, you say, "No, I don't want that. Me and my body, we're going to take care of this ourselves." Who'd be that dumb? Who'd be that foolish? But yet sometimes we're that way because we become independent to a fault. We don't need no help. I'm going to pull myself up by my bootstraps. If I hear one more man say that, by the way, I think I'm going to slap him. I've heard that so many times. I appreciate a spirit of independence and determination. But think about how that we will sometimes say, and I see this on Facebook occasionally, and I smile because my daughter uses this against me. There are certain things that kind of cause me to have my blood pressure immediately rise. And one of them is when I hear somebody say, "I got this." I just said that, and I just felt different internally when I said that. Have you ever thought about how arrogant that is to say that? Now, I know I'm hypercritical here to a lot of you. I appear to be hypercritical. Now, let me ask you to think about a different way of looking at things. A lot of times we say, "I got this," because we want to calm down somebody who is concerned about us, and we're trying to help them out. And we say, "I got this." Oh, you do? Good luck with that. I'll tell you a lot different way to put it, a different way of handling the storms of our life. God's got this, and I've got God, and this is going to be okay. I have no clue about how. I have no idea about when, but this is going to be okay because God's got this, and I've got God. You see how different that is? That is a humble admission of the fact, I need help. And I know where the best help is, the Lord. You know, the million-dollar question is not why, whenever we're suffering from great loss or in a terrible storm in our life. The million-dollar question is not why, it's who. Who knows me better than anybody else? Who knows what's going on in my life? Who knows what's going on inside of me? Who can provide every blessing in my life that I need to navigate this terrible storm in my life? We know the answer to that question. It's God. If we know the who, we can endure the what, no matter why. Why is not the million-dollar question. Who is? We need to recognize the fact that we are dependent and we need help. And the best help is with the Lord. That million-dollar question has been asked. What people consider the million-dollar question has been asked by a lot of people. It prompts you, it does. Loss and the grief we experience prompts us to wonder why. Now, there's nothing wrong, there's nothing sinful with asking that question. Many people, even the sinless Son of God, said that when he was hanging on the cross. Why have you forsaken me? Revealing his humanity in a very unique way. H. Norman Wright, who's done a lot of great writing, who also suffered the loss of his spouse, who wrote a book called Reflections of a Grieving Spouse, the first book I ever read written by a man about the loss of his wife. He made this observation: one of the greatest feats is learning to live without answers. You may never know the answer to the question why. You don't have to know the answer to that question. What you need to know is the answer to the question who. Old Brother Charles Hodge, I don't know how many of you are old enough to have heard him preach or read his writings, but what an amazing, unique communicator. It was the back of the Gospel Advocate, the last page. He wrote that article every year. And one article on the back of the Gospel Advocate, he made this observation: faith does not give us the answers. Faith gives us the ability to live without the answers. He's right. It's hard to live without answers. But we got to remember, even if we knew the answer to the question why, we still have to deal with the absence of that person or thing in our life. What I'm trying to explain is grief is really powerful. And you're not a machine. You're not a plant. You're not an inanimate object. It's going to have an effect on you. It's going to have an effect on you mentally. It's going to affect your brain function. It's going to have an effect on your feeler. It's going to cause you to struggle emotionally, psychologically, and socially even. Do you know that people who suffered great loss, especially the widowed, typically lose 75% of their social network? They don't know what to do with you. You may even scare them because they feel uncomfortable around you. They don't know what to say. They don't know what to do. When you live in a grief-illiterate society and you're experiencing grief, it makes grieving even more difficult. And it can affect you physically. I was in Rome, Georgia, just a few days ago, and I was talking to a doctor about this, and boy, he heartily agreed that whenever we've suffered great loss, we need to make it a point to stay much closer to our primary care physician than we have in the past. Because grieving exposes you to being more vulnerable physically to issues and stresses on your body. And it can affect you spiritually. You can begin to have questions about yourself, about your faith, about your church family, even about God. When we're struggling spiritually, that's nothing to be ashamed of. It's something to seek help for. And we need to be willing to accept the help of others when we're struggling with what we're experiencing and the effect it's having on our faith, on our spiritual journey. Bottom line is, this is a challenge. I mean, it's a big one. When you've suffered great loss, it is really going to challenge you. However, the neat thing about struggling with loss is you can turn it into a blessing. Now, that's not magical. It's not miraculous, but it's also not easy. But you can do it. You can take your loss and you can turn it into a gain for you and others. You can take your burden and turn it into a blessing for you and for others. But it's really hard. In Romans chapter 5, Paul has been talking about faith, about the sin of humanity, and about how that we can be saved through the sacrifice of Jesus if we respond to that grace with obedient faith. So in Romans chapter 5, he says, "Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom also we have access by faith into this grace in which we stand and rejoice in the hope of the glory of God." Now watch the next 3 verses. "And not only that, but we also glory in tribulations." If I were writing this back a few years ago, I would have said we grieve in tribulations. And we do. But we can both grieve and glory simultaneously. We grieve about some circumstances of a temporary nature, but we can always find glory, things to rejoice about and have hope in. So he says, and not only that, but we glory in tribulation, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance. And perseverance, character, and character, hope. And notice the kind of hope we're talking about here. The kind of hope in verse 5 that says, "Now hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured out in our hearts by the Holy Spirit who was given to us." Imagine that. Through tribulation, having a stronger faith, being a wiser person by experience. and actually being more useful to the Lord than we've ever been before, not in spite of what happened, but because of what happened and because of the choice we made to respond to it in wise ways. You can take burdens and you can produce blessings from your burdens. Not just for yourself, but for others. Some of you look old enough to have heard the preaching of Batzel Barrett Baxter. He was one of the best communicators I think I've ever heard. He wrote a book called When Life Tumbles In, and I conclude this session by reading a quote out of that book. When we must carry heavy burdens, we receive our greatest help, not from those who, having never carried similar burdens, stand on the sidelines and give bland advice, but from those who have been through the same valleys and have suffered the same problems. Who's going to help a person who's been diagnosed with cancer, who's staring down a valley of chemo treatments that's going to cause them to lose their hair, feel so weak, and puke their guts out, and maybe have to have surgeries? Who's going to be the best help to them? Somebody who's been down that same road, who with sincere empathy can provide inspiration because they lived through that storm. And there are some things that you experience in life that just cause you to have a common bond with other people that you have never had a common bond with had it not been from that experience that you had. We can choose, and it's a choice. Grief can ruin us. It can get us to the point where we no longer live, we just exist. But if we choose, we can take those burdens and we can turn them into blessings for ourselves and others. Let's take a break, shorter this time, because we're going to enter into what I consider the most important session of all. And that's what it's like to be widowed. Life after the loss of a spouse. Let's take a 5-minute